Hey there, Space Cats, and welcome back to another studio session. If you like whales and sea creatures, then I invite you to press the like button now before you get distracted by that dog befriending a skunk video. Imagine the conversation in that house. And while you're at it, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of my shenanigans, whale-related or otherwise. The majority of my job relates to children's picture books, and that would normally mean the layout would be portraits, that's up and down like this. But today I am going a bit rogue, and I'm going to turn the paper sideways so it's landscape, kind of like this. I think maybe it will give me a bit more space and leeway to paint something that is kind of longer and thinner, like a whale. Okay, are you ready? Let's go! I have my supplies. I'm going to use my dip pen and my waterproof calligraphy ink, which I've had this bottle for many years and it just keeps going. So as long as you keep the lid tightly on it, you're going to be fine. I've got a piece of kitchen paper and I've got my watercolour paper, smooth Daler Rowney Aquafine paper, and I've already done the first stage, which is to just do a very light pencil drawing. When you're using dip pen and ink, anything can happen. You can get quite a lot of splodges going on, so we're just going to go with a bit of a splodgy drawing today and see how we get on. So I'm just going to dip my pen in, drain it a little on the side, and I'm going to work from this side to this side so I don't smudge. Not quite enough ink on that. And what you can do is use different pressure as you're making your way across the page. Using different pressure on the pen means that you get a different thickness of line. And then as I come to the bit where I can naturally lift off, then I dip again. Just going to hold my paper down so that it's not bowing. This paper was actually rolled up, so what I did before I started was I sprayed the back of it with just some water out of a spray bottle, and then I weighted it down with some paper on both sides, some paper with nothing on, just some out of the copier, to help it flatten a bit. Okay, so before I do that line, I'm going to do his fin. Do you call them fins? His little whaley arm. Because then I can join this line. And then the one that goes under his chin, up to that fin there. So that's the first one done. I also, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give him a kind of like a bottom lip, just by drawing that little line there, and then the lines that go underneath. I need more ink. So before I do anything else, actually, I'm going to do up the top here, we need some splashes, because his tail is out of the water. So I'm going to, by using the end of my, holding the pen right down the end, that just shows that his tail's coming out of the water, or her tail actually, she's the mummy one. So now I'm going to draw the baby. lid back on the ink. I'm also going to make sure that I wipe any excess ink off of my nib, and there we go. First bit done. This has been left to dry for about an hour and a half, but I can still see there are areas, particularly around the eyes, that are still a little bit too wet at the moment for my liking. So I'm going to use my Elastomer eraser, Mono Zero Tombow eraser, which is like a pencil but with an erasable end, and I'm just going to very carefully erase some of the lines, because if I were to go over them with a normal eraser at this point it would definitely smudge. So I'm just very carefully going from outside towards the line, so if I do pick up any ink it's not going to smear right across the page. The good thing about these erasers is you can get a very fine edge, and then that way get exactly where you want to be. While I'm waiting for this to dry really thoroughly, I'm going to use some of this, which is a mask pen, and it's got some masking fluid in it. Give it a really good shake, and I'm just going to blob some tiny little dots down. It's got a really fine nib to it. I'm just going to blob it behind where I think bubbles might form from behind where the whales are swimming. And again, this is something that's really going to need to dry properly. So I might leave this, I think I might leave this for maybe another couple of hours to really let it dry very thoroughly. And here is where Editing Jules takes over. First job is to put some masking tape around the edge so that it keeps the paper flat on the piece of wood that I'm working on, and also it gives me a bit of an edge. And you saw me put down there some water. This is the way I usually work. If you've seen any of my other tutorials, I quite often work wet in wet. That means applying just water to start with on the areas where you want to put your paint. And then I go in with, at the moment, some fairly wet pigment, and that's out of tubes of Winsor & Newton watercolour paint. I'm using a really big brush, so the mistake that quite often happens when you start painting is that you use a tiny brush and think that you're going to be able to get good detail, when in actual fact it's an awful lot easier to use a mahoosive brush. And I think this is a size 16 from memory, and then going back in with some darker pigment pretty much straight out of the tube, which creates these lovely effects. Because the paper is so wet, it tends to soak up some of that liquid as well, and then makes it much easier for you to be able to put one of your colours down and it spreads about of its own accord. You know, you're not really doing very much apart from putting it on the paper, and then it spreads and makes interesting patterns. It's really a question of not being too intellectual about it, but feeling your way, what you think might work. And then if it doesn't, your paper's wet, you can always just kind of go over those bits that you don't really like. So if, for example, I put down a bit of almost pure pigment and it makes a bit of a streaky mark, at this point I can go back in and just kind of get rid of it. Because we're doing underwater scene, I'm showing where the energy of the water might be flowing in and around and behind these dear little whales, actually big whales, and also showing the depth of the water by using that very dark indigo colour. Not forgetting to go around my mask pen with a little bit of the pigment, because then it'll collect, as you can sort of see from this, it collects around where that masking fluid is, and it should be, once I've rubbed it away from the paper, when it's all dry, there'll be white marks underneath, or white paper rather, they're not marks. So if you do the pigment around the masking fluid, then it will collect and make a darker area around that sort of circle, that blob. When you rub it away, then it just highlights it a bit more. And if you're using really wet watercolour paper and you find that it bows after you've finished, then do what I did and spray the back of it and then weight it down underneath some clean paper, and you'll find it flattens out. Now for the sky, I thought what I would do is actually use a completely contrasting colour to the sea. I didn't want to have a blue sky because I thought then it's all just too blue. So I went for a really moody, kind of stormy grey, cloudy sky instead. And to do that, I mixed together a very dark brown and a very dark blue, and then I've added a little bit of a sort of purpley colour to it, and in a moment you'll see that I add pretty much neat purple. Here it is. So that is actually the purple. It's more of a sort of maroony colour that I've put in with the grey that I've already made. And that way it makes for that sort of moody scene. And there I've left the watercolour paint to merge in where that cloud is, because it gives more of an impression of cloudy weather. And again, just darkening up those edges of the page. And a bit more purple to make a bruised looking sky. The other thing that you can do when you're using your watercolour brush is you can actually remove some of the paint by drying off your brush and then dabbing at the area where you want to lose some of the pigment or some of the water, and you can remove it, a bit like using an eraser. This is a blue whale, mother and child, so I'm going with quite a dark blue for this. It's, I think, a sort of navy blue, I think it's called. Definitely not the indigo, which is the darkest of the blues that I've got. And they have this white area underneath where the lines are under the chin. That area is a sort of white or a pale colour. So I'm going to leave that. When I put the water around the whale, I had a sort of definitive line just around there where I'm painting now. And that way the pigment will go down to that but not beyond it. And then it's just a question of building up the colour before it dries completely, just adding a bit more tone to the different areas of the whale to build up where the light and shade might be. So the light is coming from above, and I'm thinking about where those highlights might meet the tail and might sit on the top of the body. The paper is still really wet and I'm keeping an eye on I'm just sort of keeping an overview, if you like, on where the wetness is. A lot of this job literally is just watching paint dry, and it's funny to me to think that people use that phrase as doing something incredibly dull or incredibly boring, whereas I actually find watching paint dry really fascinating. You can never quite tell what it's going to do. So for example, on the tail here, it's dry enough that it just spreads that pigment out a little bit and it doesn't go absolutely everywhere. I just took a little bit of wetness off of my brush there to bring down that centre part of the tail so that there's a bit more highlight on there. And now putting more shadow underneath that flipper. Yep, I've remembered the right word for it. And underneath the eye, and across this lower part of the blue bit of the body. Sometimes as well you want to be thinking about not just where the light and shade is, but which bits you want to stand out more. So I'm quite keen to have that top lip very organised in terms of what you're looking at visually. So I've made that quite dark as well. This bit has dried out sufficiently enough to be able to add even more of that dark indigo to some of the areas, and it's going to make its way upwards just a little bit, so I'm dabbing that pigment on. I really want it to stay pretty much where I've put it. As you get more used to painting with watercolours, you get a feel. It's not a sort of thought through process exactly. You just get a feel for where to put the pigment. This little baby is a bit easier to do. It's much smaller, obviously, but also it's underneath the mum, so there's a lot less to think about in terms of where the highlights might be. So just putting a little bit of dark around it. For this particular painting, I have resisted the urge to use my beloved Inktense watercolour pencils as I would normally do, but if you do have some and you really wanted to do something like this, then you could always go around the edges with a dark colour. In the bits where I've put my dark, go around those bits with a dark pencil and then use a wet clean brush to kind of smooth out the lines and merge it a bit more with the watercolour, and you'd probably get a really good effect from that. Mustn't forget the eyelid. I'm just going to leave a little white sort of crescent shape to show that it's a shaped eyelid, it's not flat. So you can do that by way of showing where the light and dark is and leaving that little moon shaped piece of white paper showing through. Here are the splashes coming off of the tail, and again, guess what I'm going to say? Leaving a little bit of highlight to show that it's the shape and also that it's water. Grabbing a bit of paler blue, like the palest of the sea that I've used here, I'm just going to make a texture on the underneath part of the belly and underneath the chin, where they collect all their plankton and start the digestive process. And instead of using a blue or a grey to do this shadow, I'm going in with some purple. I've done this once before on a different painting and I thought it looked really good, so yeah, used that kind of magenta-y purpley colour. The good thing about these brushes is they are tapered and they've got quite a fine point on the end, so depending on the pressure that you put on the brush, you can either make a really thick line and cover a large area of paper, or you can just very gently dab some colour on and put it very delicately in detail where you want it to go. I pretty much always use tapered brushes, and these are not the best set, most expensive set of brushes I've ever bought, but they do the job. Don't forget the iris. I've painted these guys with blue irises. I don't know if they have blue eyes. These ones do. And then what I've done is I've drawn around and made it a kind of mask, because something is going to happen now that is super exciting and really does make this painting. So I'm just trying to mask off as best as possible, making sure of course that the painting is dry. And then I'm getting a stiff brush, so I think this was probably an oil brush. You can use a toothbrush if you want. Pick up some fairly wet ink or watercolour paper and spray that paper. I think it makes a fantastic effect. So I'm doing the indigo colour down the bottom and then a paler blue in the middle section, and then up the top where the sky is I'm going to use that grey that I've already mixed just for the corners. And it's great because it doesn't go over any of the whale, or hardly any of the whale. And once I've finished my splurting, that's the technical term, I very carefully lift away those little pieces of paper, and hey presto, we have quite a cool effect. Now I'm going to move away with my scalpel blade some of that masking fluid. You can also wait until it's super duper dry, maybe the next day, and rub it with a clean finger. That will also help get rid of most of it, but I was just a little bit worried that I might take off some of that splurty pigment. So I thought I'd try with my scalpel first of all, and that seemed to work quite well. But I felt there wasn't quite enough in the way of bubbles, so I got some acrylic paint and a very fine paintbrush, and I made lots more bubbles. And once that's dry, you can also go back in with a shady colour and draw a little tiny line on the bottom of most of those bubbles, and it looks like shadow. The thing to remember is do not ruin your brush by leaving that acrylic paint on it. You need to wash it out as soon as you've finished with it, because otherwise when it dries, because it's got plastic in it, that's it. The brush will have died. So here we go, putting a little bit of shadow under some of those bubbles just to make them look like they're not holes, they are actually bubbles rising. And now standing back and looking at it, I realised I needed to just put a little bit of some kind of sea across part of the whale to make it look like it was under that part of the sea and its tail was sticking out into the air. So I just got my big brush and I ran one of those turquoisey colours across that upper part of his tail that's still under the sea. Her tail. Why do I keep calling this whale a him? It's very clearly a lady whale. carefully remove that masking tape. And there you have the finished piece. What do you think? I quite like that. The finished piece will be up for sale on my website. If you want to get it, then go and have a look on julesmarinerbooks.com. Here it is with some of my other whale pictures. In next week's video, I am going to teach you how to draw somebody that you know. With the festive season approaching with some speed, it could be a really good gift. All you need is a clear headshot of said person, a piece of transparent paper like layout or tracing paper, and a piece of cartridge or watercolour paper. Until then, I'm off to sneeze on a dog. No reason, I just feel like it. I will see you next week. Nanu nanu.